The sound came first, the soft drag of velvet against skin. Not silk, not rope, not iron, velvet. A fabric of intimacy and deceit. It whispered when drawn tight, a sound so gentle that it might have been mistaken for the sigh of a lover. But here, in the echoing silence of the Golden Lotus chamber, that sound marked death. Her name was Lin Hua. The court called her the fragrance of autumn, though no season ever lasted long enough to hold her beauty. She was the emperor's prized concubine, the muse behind 100 poems, and the envy of every woman who looked too closely at their reflection. When history wrote her end, it used the word peaceful. The chroniclers said she slept eternally, as though smiling. But peace is not velvet. Tonight we unravel that lie. The velvet death, a weapon sewn in secrecy during the height of the Tang dynasty's decadence, was no ordinary execution tool. It was crafted for one purpose: to make murder appear merciful, to end life without breaking beauty. The emperor could not bear the sight of spoiled flesh. No blood, no scream, only the gentle tightening of a hood that promised grace even in the last breath. But beneath the softness of that fatal cloth lay steel threads, thin as hair, strong as retribution. Each pull of the drawstring sliced through illusion, closing the world around Lin Hua's throat. It is said that the final sound she ever heard was that low, scratching whisper of velvet. The empire loved its illusions. Behind murals of paradise and porcelain courtyards, it built its rule on fear polished to the shine of art. In a dynasty where poets spoke for emperors and painters hid rebellions in brushstrokes, control was never bound in chains. It was draped in luxury, and velvet was the perfect disguise for cruelty. What can beauty mean in a world that kills for appearances? What does serenity become when it's forced? If you think history forgot Lin Hua, you are wrong. It remembered her precisely the way her killers wanted: serene, poetic, silent. The official record, written by trembling scribes, described her final moments as a willing surrender to elegance. Yet the truth lay in the breath she could not take. Her death was not surrender. It was design. Stay. Because tonight, we pull at the threads of that design. We tear open the empire's mask. This is the story of the Velvet Death. Beauty weaponized, silence sanctified, and one woman who dared to love dangerously in a world that punished desire like treason. If you are drawn to the dark pulse of forgotten history, to the secrets that empires buried beneath silk, then subscribe now to Crimson Archive. You'll need the truth, and it only gets darker from here. Now, let's return to that chamber. It was the 12th night of the Chrysanthemum Festival. Lanterns hung outside the palace gates, swaying like small, dying moons. Inside, in a sealed lower hall perfumed with sandalwood, Lin Hua waited. Her body was draped in violet silk, her wrists bare, her hair pinned high with a comb shaped like a bird mid-flight, a gift from the emperor himself. She had worn it even when the guards came, perhaps believing this was just another test of obedience. In the Tang court, women were often praised for their stillness. The perfect concubine did not speak of dreams. She breathed art and exhaled silence. Lin Hua had learned that lesson well, until she forgot her place. They said her crime was envy or arrogance, or the theft of a sacred poem meant for the empress. But in truth, her only sin was attention. She became too visible. The emperor's desire for her grew loud enough to wound the pride of another. And so the machinery of elegance began to turn. The empress whispered to the minister of ceremonies, and the minister spoke to the grand tutor, who in turn summoned the keeper of instruments. It took 14 days to prepare the velvet hood, the finest black velvet from Shu, silver-threaded drawstrings woven with filaments of steel so fine they could cut silk, the inner seam lined with ointment to prevent bruising. The emperor would not tolerate imperfection. It was an artisan's work, its cruelty measured, precise, and yet nothing within its making was as terrifying as its purpose. The velvet death erased guilt. It left no mark of violence. Court chroniclers could call it mercy. Executioners could call it art. It turned murder into mythology. When the guards entered, the sound of their boots struck the marble like hammer blows. But what followed next, the sound of that velvet being drawn from an oaken chest, unfolding, whispering, that was the moment the stories began to fracture. Lin Hua, they said, did not beg. Perhaps she still believed a poem could save her. Perhaps she thought the emperor would arrive, as he had done before, to stop the sentence and turn it into a dance of forgiveness. But he never came. He was in another chamber, writing a verse that would immortalize her death while it was still happening. Imagine that kind of power, to compose beauty while extinguishing it, to fold brutality into verse. The court called him enlightened. Lin Hua called him my son. He became her final eclipse. The executioner was a woman, old, expressionless, almost tender. The emperor had decreed that no man should touch Lin Hua's skin in her final hour. The old woman carried the hood in both hands, as though it were a newborn child. The velvet made its whisper again as it passed Lin Hua's cheek. And then the first tightening, a pull that sounded like a sigh. Another, slower this time. The air around her thickened. The sound faded to something like a heartbeat. She was not screaming. She could not. The chroniclers later wrote that she smiled as though in a dream. But those who secretly watched saw something else. A tremor in the fingertips, a single tear slipping beneath the velvet's edge, caught by the wire threads before it could fall. When her body stilled, the empress ordered the hood removed. Lin Hua's face was smooth, untouched, radiant, except for the faintest red line beneath her chin, so fine it vanished as the light shifted. She looked asleep. The emperor would later commission a painting that showed her lying among chrysanthemums, serene. The painting hung in his study for 20 years. The sound of velvet followed him. Every night he said he could hear it, that soft, closing whisper, in the dark. And that is how the empire wrote mercy into murder. That is how empires survive, not by erasing cruelty, but by teaching the world to call it elegance. Tonight, we begin to open what they swore was beautifully sealed, because every empire's silence still carries the sound of velvet if you listen closely enough. Hear how that sound became law, how execution became ritual, and how Lin Hua's death was only the beginning of the Velvet Death's quiet reign. The sound of velvet, so soft, so deceitful, did not end with Lin Hua's final breath. It traveled through the corridors of Chang'an like smoke from an incense burner that never extinguished. Servants whispered of it behind perfumed screens. Ministers heard it in their sleep. Even the empress, triumphant in her vengeance, began to imagine its hush when she turned her head at night. That's what cruelty does when it's designed beautifully. It lingers, invisible, yet everywhere. The Velvet Death was not forgotten. It was institutionalized. After Lin Hua's execution, the court declared the device a divine instrument of harmony. Officially, it was for traitors who had disturbed imperial serenity. In truth, it became the weapon of choice for erasing those who made the court uneasy. Velvet didn't just kill, it redefined obedience. In the imperial archives, rarely opened and only under red lantern light, there exists a memorandum written 2 winters after Lin Hua's death. The chief executioner, addressed only as Mistress of the Silent Room, described in precise calligraphed detail how each use of the hood should proceed. The ritual began with fragrance, a blend of poppy, clove, and chrysanthemum applied to mask dread. The condemned was draped in light silk. Music must play from behind a screen. A single drawn bowstring on the piper instrument marked the moment of death. All of this to make terror sound like ceremony. Behind such refinement was strategy. The Velvet Death could kill dissenters without spectacle. No bodies hung, no screams reached the street. It allowed the emperor to erase lives quietly, while ensuring that the myth of benevolence endured. Artists painted what they imagined: peaceful deaths, graceful departures, women floating into eternity. The empire didn't censor violence. It beautified it until no one could recognize it anymore. Lin Hua's death had taught them something, that fear wrapped in elegance is more efficient than terror chained in brutality. and the sound of velvet tightening became the soundtrack of invisible control. How do you rebel against silence? The question haunted court women most of all. They were both lenses and mirrors, desired, displayed, dismissed. They learned quickly that the difference between being admired and being executed was one whisper too loud. Each time the velvet sounded, another woman disappeared. A servant accused of gossip. A poetess who wrote verses about longing that the empress found too personal. Even a dancer who refused to smile when commanded. All disappeared, each gently relieved of unrest. No one saw bruises. That made it worse. The chroniclers, men with trembling brushes, could not cross out imperial crimes. They encoded warnings in metaphors instead, poems about autumn petals withering under moonlight, eyes that close but do not sleep. The more they tried to hide rebellion in verse, the more the court celebrated those very poems as romantic tributes. Subversion became decoration. That too was part of the mechanism. And then there were the artisans who designed the hoods. None were soldiers. They were tailors, weavers, metalworkers, craftsmen who once made royal garments. When the Imperial Bureau of Instruments summoned them, they were told to serve beauty unto its end. They obeyed. Those who protested vanished behind silk curtains, replaced by others eager to survive. Each new velvet hood became finer, quieter. Some even scented the velvet so the last breath would carry perfume. Every improvement was rewarded by decree. Some records claim that at the height of the Tang court's decadence, there were 14 velvet hoods locked beneath the palace in the Chamber of Still Grace, each named after a flower: orchid, magnolia, plum, lotus. The first, the prototype that had silenced Lin Hua, was called chrysanthemum. None who entered that chamber left unmarked by its silence, and somewhere among those artifacts lay a list. One by one, the names of courtesans, poets, and scholars appeared in neat brushstrokes beside each hood. It was never labeled List of Executions. It was titled Attendance of Serenity. Imagine that, the empire cataloguing death as service. Even the emperor, now aging, came to believe his own invention was divine mercy. He claimed dreams guided him, dreams in which the goddess of compassion told him to grant peace to those burdened with vanity. But his court knew better. The velvet death was not divine. It was desperation given elegance. Every time he lost control, he offered beauty as disguise. The empress, however, turned it into currency. She discovered the velvet death's most insidious form of power: anticipation. Once word spread that an object so silent, so gentle, could end a life, obedience deepened without a word spoken. Servants bowed lower. Poets censored themselves before writing. Dancers perfected smiles even when tears burned their eyes. And so began what scholars would later call the era of perfumed subjugation. In this twilight culture, cruelty disguised as refinement became a doctrine. Pain rebranded as grace. Execution as poetry. The empire exported its hypocrisy in scrolls, songs, and paintings. No one questioned the price of harmony, for fear their name would be embroidered next. Listen closely even now to that sound. Velvet sliding, whispering. It was in every act of obedience. It was in every poem that praised the throne. There's a surviving testimony, fragmented, found among relics centuries later, written by a servant named Chulan. She had served tea on the night Lin Hua died. Her handwriting trembled like someone writing underwater. "The hood was beautiful," she wrote, "softer than any cloth I knew. I thought at first it was a gift, but then I heard what velvet sounds like when death moves inside it." Her testimony ends mid-sentence, as if the ink itself refused to finish. But her words tell us everything. The sound of velvet, the empire's hush, was not absence. It was pressure. The silence that follows when every voice has learned to lie, and that silence became law. By decree, the velvet death could not be spoken of except in metaphors sanctioned by the Bureau of Rights. Forbidden words included execution, crime, and punishment. Instead, they were to be replaced with attainment, release, and elegance. The vocabulary of oppression transformed into poetry. And once the language itself bent, morality followed. Centuries later, historians would marvel at how a device so small, so quiet, could unmake an empire's soul without spilling a drop of blood. But in the Tang court, no one dared to marvel. They feared to even remember. Those who did remember, the painters, the poets, the women who buried their truth in scent and silk, found ways to survive through ritual acts of concealment. Some embroidered red threads into robes, a signal only those who knew could read. Grief disguised as beauty. And yet the sound of velvet haunted them. It crept into songs and bedtime tales. Parents warned children to speak softly, or the velvet will hear you. It became legend, myth, ghost. But behind the myth, the device endured, hidden, honed. Each whisper a reminder that the empire's cruelty was not an accident. It was policy disguised as virtue. What happens when a society learns to love the tool that kills it? That question would echo long after the last hood was sealed. But before the myth could fade, one act would shatter the illusion, a single rebellion that ripped the velvet apart and exposed the wire beneath, and it would begin not with a weapon, but with a poem. Uncover how Lin Hua's death ignited a hidden resistance, and how years later, that same sound of velvet returned to the palace, not as an instrument of power, but as vengeance whispered through silk. It began in silence, the same silence that birthed the velvet death, but this time it trembled. Chang'an, the jeweled heart of the Tang dynasty, began to pulse with unwritten words. Behind embroidered curtains and lacquered screens, something was stirring. Not rebellion in the streets, but quiet defiance in ink. Lin Hua might have died with a hood over her face, but her memory refused to suffocate. Her name became a ghost, carried in whispers among the women of the inner court, each one passing it like a coded prayer. They called her the sleeper who saw. No one said martyr. No one dared say murdered. Yet every woman who repeated her name felt a strange weight. Not grief, but recognition. You see, even the most flawless dynasty cannot silence the sound of velvet forever. Because once you teach the world that elegance can kill, people start listening differently. They start to hear the velvet in every law, every poem, every breath. That is how an empire begins to suffocate itself. The rebellion began with poetry. Of course it did. A new poet appeared at court. He called himself Zhao Wen. But that name, historians later discovered, was a disguise. Behind it was a woman named Chu Lan, the same servant who had written about the hood, the one whose final words had vanished mid-sentence. She was alive, or at least something of her was. To trace her story, we need to return to that night, the night Lin Hua died. When the velvet drew tight, Chu Lan had turned her face away, pretending not to see. But that sound of velvet crossing flesh, never left her. It became the drumbeat beneath every dream. When the guards left, she touched the stone floor where Lin Hua had fallen. It was damp, not with blood, but with the scent of perfume and fear. That smell clung to her hands for years. She escaped the chamber with a piece of the hood's fringe, a single thread of black velvet. For years, she kept it coiled inside a carved wooden ring. She watched courtiers bow, dancers twirl, poets recite verses praising peace, and every time she heard someone say harmony, she heard that whisper of velvet again. So she began to write. The poems appeared anonymously, left on silk fans or slipped into the sleeves of noblewomen. The first one was short, 12 lines about a bird flying into a velvet night, too soft to bruise and too gentle to wake. To the men of the court, it was just a love verse. To the women, it was a warning. Then came the second poem, hidden inside a bouquet gifted to the empress. It spoke of threads that sing when tightened, and sleeping beauties who never wake. The empress ordered the poem burned, but she kept reading it first, because somewhere inside she recognized herself, enthroned but strangled, loved but bound. The velvet death was not just killing women, it was killing empathy. Soon across the empire, whispers turned into songs. Maidens humming while weaving began to alter lyrics subtly, interlacing forbidden lines between verses. Pain was becoming melody. The servants called the growing movement The murmuring. When rebellion hides in art, no empire can crush it cleanly. After all, how do you execute a metaphor? The emperor, meanwhile, grew old and haunted. He could no longer sleep. Each night he woke, gasping, claiming he heard the sound, that same soft drag of velvet tightening beside his ear. Some thought madness, others guilt, but no one dared speak of Lin Hua. They called the noise the velvet wind and lit incense to chase it away. And then it happened. The shock no one expected. The return of the hood. On the night of the Lantern Festival, the emperor entered his chamber to find a gift placed beside his writing desk, a lacquered box of redwood bound by silk cord. The guards swore they had searched everything. Inside, the very hood used on Lin Hua. The velvet was immaculate. Someone had cleaned it, restored it, perfumed it. A scroll lay folded within. It was written in unmistakably female calligraphy. Peace has many faces. Some sleep beneath it. No signature, no seal, only the faint red imprint of a tear on the paper. The emperor ordered a lockdown. He interrogated every servant, every eunuch, every woman of the palace. But the truth was already beyond reach. The murmuring had spread into every circle. Dancers hid poems in their sleeves, priests painted warnings beneath temple murals. The empire's beauty had become its confession. In the weeks that followed, the emperor's paranoia deepened. He demanded the destruction of every velvet hood. But when the officials descended into the chamber of still grace, the hoods were gone. Every single one vanished. The iron locks were unbroken. The silks that once covered the boxes were found folded neatly on the floor. Some said the servants stole them, smuggling them out in laundry baskets. Others swore the hoods were taken by the same spectral hands that placed Lin Hua's hood in the emperor's study. Whatever the truth, their disappearance marked the first true fracture in imperial order. What followed, history recorded cautiously: unexplained deaths among high-ranking courtiers. No marks, no blood, only the faintest indentation beneath the jaw, as if brushed by cloth. Ministers found lifeless in gardens, scribes collapsing mid-ceremony, each face frozen in calm. Officially, the records blamed exhaustion, bad air, or divine wrath. But the servants began to whisper, "The velvet has remembered." Over the next year, the emperor's rule fell into madness. He no longer trusted his own robes. He made the tailors wear every garment before he touched it. He stripped his chambers of velvet and ordered all draperies replaced with hemp. Yet even hemp began to sound sinister to him, the rasp of it against skin like a ghost, mocking the softness he once worshipped. The empire staggered beneath paranoia. No one dared recite poetry. Instruments were silenced. Painters refused commissions depicting sleep or beauty. It was said that even the moonlight over Chang'an grew pale, as if frightened of what it shone upon. And then, the shock that ended it all. One morning, the palace guards found the emperor seated at his desk, head bowed as though studying a scroll. He had died silently in the night. His face was unmarked, serene, perhaps even peaceful. But around his neck was a single loop of velvet thread, drawn so gently that the skin beneath barely dimpled. The guards fled the chamber screaming. The empress ordered the room sealed. None dared touch the body. His death was described officially as a divine passing. But those who knew whispered that justice had found him in silk instead of sword. Some said Chu Lan herself returned to perform the execution, slipping through walls like smoke. Others claimed the ghost of Lin Hua had risen beneath the chrysanthemum moon. Whichever version you believe, the sound of velvet whispered once more that night, echoing through the halls, growing fainter and fainter until every ear was forced to listen. And then there was silence. The dynasty never recovered. The next emperor would spend years purging courtiers, trying to restore faith in beauty, in poetry, in mercy. But the whisper of velvet remained, invisible, unforgettable. An empire that built its pride on elegance had drowned in it. And so Lin Hua, the woman who died beautifully, lived eternally in legend. Not as a courtesan, not as a ghost, but as a warning, because history learned, too late, that when you kill truth softly, the silence becomes a weapon. Centuries passed, Emperors fell, dynasties turned to dust, and the palaces of Chang'an sank into ruin. But the sound of velvet did not die. It merely changed form. In the age of republics and neon skylines, scholars dismissed the story as myth, a ghost tale embroidered by fearful courtiers. They treated it as metaphor, a political allegory for repression, a poetic caution for vanity and control. Yet every time a state silenced dissent in the name of harmony, every time beauty was polished to hide cruelty, the whisper of velvet seemed to return, invisible but near. The velvet death had become an idea. It no longer required a hood or wire-threaded silk. It lived instead in subtler forms, the propaganda photograph retouched to erase bruises, the online influencer smiling through curated despair, the woman performing cheer while her voice is smothered beneath expectation. Soft power is still velvet, and the thread that tightens now is global, manufactured by corporations instead of emperors, spun through aesthetics rather than laws. The difference between repression and refinement, between silk and shackle, is paper-thin, and humanity has forgotten how to tell them apart. When comfort looks like control, how many of us would even notice the wire sliding beneath the cloth? Modern psychologists use another term for this pattern, the beautification of obedience. History calls it taste. Empires call it peace. Victims call it silence. But in essence, it is the same paradox that killed Lin Hua, the worship of serenity at any cost. Even now, museums display artifacts from the Tang dynasty, mirrors, combs, robes, each labeled as symbols of refinement. But no velvet hood is ever shown. That absence is the empire's final lie. The missing object remains more powerful than any relic preserved, because what cannot be displayed still dictates what we admire. Listen closely when people say, "It was a different time." Hear that softness, that rationalization. That too is velvet. Some historians claim the velvet death inspired later European inventions, that Renaissance executioners studied Tang rituals for their quiet efficiency. Whether myth or fact, the influence echoes in the aesthetics of death made beautiful. Paintings of angels cradling poisoned saints, guillotines gleaming like sculpture, even photographs of war filtered into serenity for consumption. Our fascination with graceful suffering is nothing new. It's imperial conditioning, refined, globalized, the soft drag of velvet against the past. You can still hear it in the language of modern power. Governments speak of saving face, corporations preach brand harmony, media masks catastrophe beneath cinematic music and smiling anchors. It's all the same silk drawn tight, beauty weaponized to quiet discomfort. Lin Hua's tragedy is not ancient at all. It plays out daily in curated perfection, in silence rewarded as civility. The world still punishes those who disrupt the illusion. Activists disappear behind polite headlines. Artists are censored by aesthetic expectation. Women in power are adored, then destroyed, for what they symbolize rather than what they are. The velvet death persists, not as blood, but as performance. If you walk through Shanghai today, or Beijing, or Paris, or Los Angeles, you might find velvet boutiques in narrow alleys, their windows reflecting beauty and restraint. Beneath the fabric's surface lies the oldest promise in history: obey beautifully, and you will be spared. That was the lie told to Lin Hua, the lie told by every empire since. And yet, the hope she left behind still moves through art. Somewhere in anonymous poetry, in acts of quiet defiance, she breathes, just as Chulan once did, through rebellion disguised as grace. Every whisper of truth slipped beneath delicate words, every protest hidden inside song, carries forward her resistance. The murmuring never really died. It became humanity's heartbeat beneath the noise of civilization. Maybe that's why whenever you watch a heroine smile despite cruelty or see injustice framed as dignity, something unsettles you. You sense it, velvet, tightening around the throat of the world. This is not a ghost story, it's a mirror. The velvet death was never only about one woman's execution. It was a prophecy of what happens when society elevates beauty above truth. Lin Hua's serene face became immortal, not because she was divine, but because the world needed to lie about its cruelty. The empire's historians wrote her death as poetry. The modern world uploads the same aesthetic into pixels. Both pretend peace, while silence presses softly against the skin. What if the most dangerous weapon is not violence but presentation? Every time we choose polish over honesty, every time we filter pain to make it shareable, we tighten the hood one quiet pull further. We are all living in velvet now. But there is a choice, always. The whisper can be reversed. To pull back the hood is to name the cruelty for what it is. Soft suffocation sold as beauty. Lin Hua's memory demands that we listen, that we push against that silk barrier until it rips. And when it rips, the sound will not be velvet anymore. It will be truth. So if you still hear that whisper at night, that soft closing sound in your ears when you read about injustice made beautiful, remember, that is the echo of Lin Hua's breath reminding you to speak, to resist, to live uncensored, unfiltered, unpolished, because beauty without conscience is the first step back toward the chamber. And if we let the world's velvet lull us again, her serenity will have been for nothing. So listen closely. You can hear it still. The sound of velvet, breathing softly, waiting for silence to return. Don't let it. If this story stirred something in you, stay with us here at Crimson Archive. Subscribe, not for spectacle, but for remembrance. We resurrect the truths empires tried to bury under silk, because memory is the only weapon soft enough to slip through tyranny's grasp and sharp enough to cut its threads. This is Crimson Archive, where elegance ends and the truth begins.